Welcome to Syntheses Conversations. I'm Patrick Martin. Recently, I had the opportunity to sit down with Chuck Lief and discuss poverty. Chuck is the current president of Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. He has many years of experience dealing with the issue. Chuck begins the interview by telling us a little bit about his background.
My name is Chuck Lief. I'm the president of Naropa University. I've been involved with Naropa since its founding in 1974. Initially as a lawyer in Boulder, Naropa was one of our clients. As a student of Naropa's founder, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, whom I started studying with in 1970 when he first came to North America. As a member of the Board of Trustees, which is the governing body of the university, and the last 4 years as president.
Chuck, you were a student of the Tibetan Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. In my research on this topic, I came across a lengthy quote of his and wanted to share it with you and ask what you thought of it. Quote, "Too often the politics of this world are based on poverty. If people are poor, they want to take money or resources away from those who have more. And if people are wealthy, in the sense of having money, then they want to hold on to what they have, because they think that giving up some of their money will make them impoverished. With that mentality on both sides, it is difficult to imagine any fundamental change taking place. Or if it does take place, it is based on a tremendous hatred and violence, because both sides are hanging on so tightly to what they think is important." Unquote. Chogyam Trungpa. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think the quote fairly states the tension between the sense of poverty and the sense of wealth. I would have wanted to probe a little more deeply if I'd been in the room with him now about the perception that what poor people want to do is basically have resources reallocated, or they want to take money, because I think that's probably, there was probably more to unpack there. I think a lot of poor people are so disempowered, sometimes for generations and generations, that even the idea of receiving more resources or reallocating resources isn't even in the remote area of possibility. And so I guess I resonate more clearly with the fact that, at least in my experience, many people with wealth put a lot of effort into holding on to that wealth. Mm-hmm. What resonates a little less for me is the fact that, there's a lot of people that are without resources, or we would call poor, who are not particularly looking to those that have resources to solve the problem. In some cases, I think there's a desire to kind of shift their place in the world based on their own efforts or the efforts of their peers in the community. And in some cases, there's just so much generational oppression that there's no motivation or inspiration to do anything other than just accept what was kind of put upon them, which we call poverty. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a complicated, any quote is hard to deal with. A few sentences is never going to capture it. Mm-hmm.
Chuck, do you think it's possible to help people who don't ask for it?
So I guess to begin with, and I'm going to talk as if I've always known these things, and that's not true. So this has been, I still continue to evolve in terms of how I can impact anyone else's life or situation. So you shouldn't take it as being, my journey to figure this stuff out is ongoing, and it will be probably till I drop dead. So that's just the nature of it. So I've come to think that I don't necessarily provide assistance to anybody, and I think that was one of the early mistakes that I personally made. That there was so I'm kind of trained as a lawyer, but I also have this contemplative practice. But I kind of had this view that somebody presents with a problem or a whole set of problems. There are conceptual, clear and logical ways to fix those problems, and that might be called assistance. I'm not sure what you quite were getting at with assistance, but I realized that And in some cases, I think that's true. I think if somebody shows up at your door that hasn't eaten, you can actually fix that problem in the relative sense by feeding them, by offering food. So I'm not suggesting at all that you can't actually take on issues. And I think, in fact, sometimes we get ourselves caught up in this sense that the kind of bite-size actions or reactions to actions is not something that is worthwhile because it doesn't change whole systems in some way. So I do believe that there are things that you can do to simply be helpful to people. On the other hand, I think that if you're going to kind of take on dealing with the sort of suffering that perhaps you voluntarily encounter, and whether, in my case, whether it's extreme poverty, meaning lack of material wealth, or whether it's living with AIDS or dying with AIDS or whatever those issues are, if you're going to take it on, you need to have some real personal contemplation and reflection on the context within which you're going to actually do your work. And so it feels to me that one of the things I learned was that for me, the work involved as much kind of creating the space within which I was going to work as much as it did coming up with the kind of lists and categories and the sort of checklist of ways to fix things. That takes a kind of patience, which when you're dealing with suffering is sometimes hard to conjure up, because if somebody is suffering in front of you, what you want to do is actually relieve the suffering in the most immediate way that you can. But the reality is, for something to be long-lasting and really transformative of somebody's situation, it takes a lot more work, and that sometimes takes more time and a lot more personal work, as much personal work as it does how you manifest outside to the other person that sort of shows up in your world.
Chuck, in the spirit of my last question, I'd like to know what you think about the sentiment that you can't help people that aren't willing to help themselves. What do you think a statement like that might actually mean?
Yeah, so I don't buy it. I mean, I think that, and even in kind of whatever Western social policy, I think that that's definitely debated. So, for example, I was very involved in, for a long time in creating housing for people that were homeless, right? And, there was a stream of thought for a long time, until not many, maybe, 15 or 20 years ago, that it was okay to create a set of expectations that if you were going to provide housing to somebody who was homeless, they had to kind of sign a contract with you, whether that was they had to be clean and sober, or they had to be, engaged in education, or they had to, whatever the conditions were. When the fact was that it's quite conceivable, in fact, there's a movement now called Housing First, which says what you need to do with somebody who's homeless is give them housing, stop. The conditions don't come ahead of that. If you want to then work with somebody once they're more stable and once they have a roof over their head and they're safe, if you then want to deal with issues of sobriety, issues of chronic unemployment, issues of poor choices around health and that sort of thing, you can do that. But to make it a bargain at the front end as if you're basically going to punish somebody by, that isn't prepared to kind of get into that agreement by keeping them out on the street, it actually seems like a non-compassionate way to move forward. On the other hand, that takes a lot more willingness to invite the kind of chaos that comes along with people that don't make that can't move to whatever we consider to be good behavior as a condition. So, you have to then be willing to take people where they are, and where they are is sometimes tough. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I think to ask somebody to state their intention, like I intend to let you help me, I intend to be helped, I intend to be your partner in this journey, great. if it's honest and somebody actually is at a place in their life where they can make that statement. But to say that failing that ability, they're not worthy of help because it isn't going to work anyway, I don't buy.
Chuck, do you think housing is a human right?
My view is that in a society that absolutely has the means to alleviate conditions like homelessness or chronic hunger, to pick two, or poor or illness in many ways, that anybody that is a member of that society has the right to receive housing, healthcare, food. Mm-hmm. So sure, I do. And I think it has to do, I think it's relative, right? Because it's within in our society. I could certainly see other situations where the means are not there, and so then calling it a right immediately sets up some kind of unnecessary tension or potential for social discord. In our society, it's just simply a lack of willingness to allocate resources, because the problem could certainly be fixed.
Chuck, how did you get involved in this kind of work? How did you initially find your path?
So how did I move on the path that I moved on? In a way, it's hard to know. Some of it, I didn't grow up. I grew up comfortably, but in a family that I only learned kind of later in my life, really, we were poor. I didn't quite understand what that meant, because it's just that, I ate 3 meals a day and I went to school and, whatever. But then when I left to go to college, and I went to college with a whole lot of people with a whole lot more money than I did, that was the first place that I kind of thought, there is actually a difference. And, so I don't know exactly where the inspiration came from. I guess I'd say it started as an emotional reaction to suffering. And I say emotional because I didn't know enough to have it be a kind of intellectual reaction. I just knew that I felt badly if I saw people struggling. And so without even knowing what that meant, I knew that I felt less good. And so I think that was a kind of very unformed beginning of it. And then, some of it was based on mentorship. I was interested in, when I was in high school, I was very interested in politics, and I thought I would probably get involved in politics. And I had a teacher who sort of worked things out so that I spent most of a semester in high school working for a mayor campaign in Ohio. Who was person who was named Carl Stokes, who became the first black mayor of any northern big American city in Cleveland. And I was able to spend half a day almost every day for 6 months working on this campaign. And, it was the first time that I actually felt I really understood the minority majority issue, because I was one of the actually few white people in this campaign. And I was a kid. And so I was on this other side of something which I had never really experienced. But it also meant that the kinds of things that I was looking at a campaign that was built on trying to do something about poverty, about bad education, about bad food, in a very, in a part of the world where actually my parents worked really hard to get us out of, and even though, as I said, we didn't have a lot of money, but we moved from inner city Cleveland to a old suburb just because it was not a great place to be. So it started out that way. I went to college. I got very involved then. It was during the time of the Vietnam War, and so maybe not surprisingly, the kind of natural reaction was, for me, was to kind of move from something local into something more broader, which was a lot of anti-war politics. In the middle of that, I had gone to the as part of my political work, I'd gone to the convention, Democratic convention in Chicago in 1968, and I got tear gassed and I got hit a few times, and it kind of moved me from being a fairly reasonable high school kid activist into being a bit more radicalized, because I saw aggression in a much different way. Something about getting tear gas and getting hit, you experience aggression a little bit differently than you do by sitting in a campaign office someplace and reading policy papers. So, it kind of built on one on top of the other. And then I guess, to my good fortune was that it was at that same time as I was getting much more engaged in understanding struggle and suffering and poverty and oppression, that I also met Trungpa Rinpoche. And so when I was 19, I also became a student of Buddhism, and I developed my own contemplative practice. And, I consider that to be, it'd be dramatic to say that it saved my life, but it definitely provided a perspective. I don't know what would have happened if I had not made that connection. I could easily imagine having, spiraling into a pretty intense, pretty aggressive world. But whatever, it did happen, and so I can't define, I can't project what might have happened if it didn't. Mm-hmm. And so I was then in this place where I had the ability to both, kind of work personally using contemplative tools, meditation, that kind of thing, and at the same time with no discouragement about remaining active. I mean, the thing about Trungpa Rinpoche is that there was no leave the world behind message in his teachings at all. And so I was able to kind of make some choices, which was, if I was going to be in the world, I wanted to be as effective as I could be. And in my particular view, it was, how do we, what can I use as leverage to make a difference? And so I thought one way was to go to law school, because I had this sense that lawyers had a certain amount of power to change things or to impact things or protect people or whatever it was. And, to some extent, I still believe that. I think that's true. And the social entrepreneurship, which is what you asked me, my sense was that we lived in a capitalist society which had, frankly, perpetuated poverty and oppression in many ways. And at the same time, money and power also was a kind of an opportunity to, directed properly, also provided an opportunity to make some broad system changes that, government or less effective nonprofits that were unwilling to deal with money and power weren't ever going to be able to do. And so I thought it was just another place to play with how does one work with resources, and it's almost like an alchemy exercise or something like that of taking something like money or influence or power and actually using it in a way that's other than the way that we were trained to use it. Mm-hmm. And so instead of using money to accumulate more for personal satisfaction, is how do you use money to actually empower others, that kind of thing. So yeah. I wish I could say it was all based on some grand philosophical plan that I had in front of me, but I didn't. I kind of made it up.
Chuck, what's the role and balance between governmental assistance programs and non-governmental organizations, like the Greyston Foundation, in addressing social issues?
So I think that the benefit of non-governmental agencies, whether it's called an NGO or a nonprofit, whatever we call it, is twofold, or maybe multifaceted. One is that those agencies can be more narrowly focused and therefore potentially have more impact on a specific problem than the government is ever going to be able to do. I think that those agencies are answerable to a constituency that are more made up of like-minded people, and government by nature is answerable to people that have the widest possible array of opinions about how to address these social issues. And so, a nonprofit dealing with AIDS healthcare can focus on dealing with AIDS healthcare. Government dealing with AIDS healthcare also has to focus on the fact that some people think that people with AIDS deserved it. There's the whole range of issues. And so I do think that when a government elects to partner with a nonprofit, it's a way of actually putting more, it's kind of like a laser. I mean, it's a more concentrated energy into addressing a particular problem. I'm still fundamentally supportive of a democratic system, and so I don't know. I don't believe that the government should completely delegate all of its responsibility to non-governmental agencies, because I think otherwise, to get broad community buy-in, it actually takes a community-created institution, which at least in the U.S. we call government. We can argue about corruption in politics and all of that, but the fact of the matter is, I think there is a place for the community to come together in dialogue with differing views, and right now the structure we have for that is through political action and political campaigns and debates and all of that kind of thing. So I do think that there's a place for that, but I think the partnering. Nonprofits can be more nimble. Nonprofits can be more innovative in many ways. They're less bound to the kinds of things the government is. And on the other hand, the government controls resources that just completely overshadow most nonprofits' ability. And so, there's also that needs to be considered. Sort of how do you tap into those resources?
Chuck, what is poverty?
Well, I think it is, to me, to me, I think poverty is the perceived absence of something. And so while I think we naturally think of poverty as meaning lack of material wealth, I think it can be lack of anything. It can be lack of peace of mind. It can be there's any number of things where any one of us countless times during the day feel impoverished. It's lack of warmth if the weather turns cold, and it's lack of air conditioning if the weather turns hot, and all of those sorts of things. And I don't think I'm not trying to be glib, because I do think that that's the root. So there's a kind of a discontent that happens all the time, which is we can quickly jump and say that that's poverty. Trungpa Rinpoche talked about poverty mentality a lot, and he wasn't talking about materialism here. He was talking about who we are as human beings, and the fact that we frequently go through our day and go through our life feeling that something is missing. And the real question then is, how do you not just fill what is missing by, kind of finding it as if it's outside of you, but how do you actually deal with that view of feeling something is missing by taking a even more close personal look and coming to potentially some realization that you actually have everything that you need from that perspective already. That said, if you don't have money to buy food and you're hungry, and you don't have money to pay rent and you're living on the street, that's real poverty. So, I think that we can't turn this into a spiritual abstraction, even though I think that's a really important piece of the work that we need to do, those of us that are privileged enough to be able to do that work without really worrying about where our next meal is going to come from. And at the same time, I think we have to address the real needs that people have, that they do need to know where their next meal is going to come from or how they're going to stay out of the rain. Mm-hmm. And so there's a place for the more conventional definition of poverty to be looked at very deeply as well. And it can't become a kind of a spiritual exercise alone. Now, can you hold both of those perspectives about poverty? I totally think you can. And I think that's the reason really that any teacher that I've worked with that talks about working on one's own suffering and one's own sense of feeling impoverished also talks about the the absolute imperative to manifest as compassionate individuals, and while you're doing whatever personal work you're doing, also helping others who are suffering in their own ways. And I think that both of those are really crucial.
What image comes to mind when you think of poverty?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, going back to where we started from, I mean, in a sense, I guess two things come to mind. So one is I spent so much of my career trying to be helpful to single women with kids that when if you were to ask me that question, I guess I have to say that the first image that comes to mind is the families that I experienced who, from my point of view, just didn't deserve the circumstances that they were in. And so there is a sense of, I quickly kind of visualize people that are kind of, they're really profoundly disheartened by the fact that they lived in a social structure that basically seemingly didn't care about their circumstances. So that's sort of the emotional piece. I guess the other is, which makes me a bad Dharma practitioner maybe, is I do think of poverty as a kind of it's a kind of frightening absence of something not particularly conceptual. And there's thousands of Dharma books that suggest that that's actually a moment of opportunity to become realized or enlightened or something like that. And the reality is, for most of us, I think it's the scariest place for us to be, and sort of how to work with that, I think, is very powerful. But when I think about poverty, I think about emptiness in a way, and I probably have books on my shelf behind me about emptiness being luminous and rich, but the fact of the matter is it's still kind of crossing that divide is that scary stuff.
What do you think about the traumatic nature of talking about poverty and possibly using artistic methods to spark the conversation?
Well, and that's kind of it's kind of the privilege in being in a place like this, because there's people that are going to approach those kinds of issues from so many different directions that, and they'll all be challenging. But yeah, the ground kind of the rug gets pulled out from under you a lot, which I think is a good thing. Yeah. I've kind of always, as much as I would say it's not necessarily the most pleasant place to be, the one, of everything that Trungpa Rinpoche was able to do in my relationship with him is the ground constantly shifted. And I didn't know why, but I knew early on you had to either embrace that or this was not the place to be. Working in that relationship with a spiritual teacher of that type. And I just made the choice that, what the hell, I'll just let it happen and see what arises from it. And for some people it's just they needed something, it's understandable and and it's fine, but they wanted something a lot more predictable in a way. And, I was never into being predictable, so it seemed fine. Yeah.
Poverty is often socially defined, particularly abject poverty. Do you think we can ever escape the influence of others, particularly in the way their influence shapes the way we define our own worlds?
Oh, no. So no. Okay. I mean, I think that, there's everything is about words, but there's a particular Buddhist saying, in terms of talking about who we are as human beings and aspirations and contemplative practice, which says becoming suddenly free from fixed mind, which I think it sort of flashes all the time for me, is that, there's that moment where you kind of have the choice to either freeze space or be willing to let it go. And even though the letting it go is probably the more risky of the choices, but I think in terms of who I want to be as a practitioner, as a Dharma contemplative practitioner. I think that, willingness to kind of let go of my fixed views about things, I guess that is saying I continue to be influenced by, it's not just other people. I mean, it's circumstances, it's whatever the inputs are. I mean, I think somehow welcoming them all as, potential game changers isn't a bad thing.
And that concludes our interview with Chuck Lief. I'd like to thank Chuck and Naropa University for the opportunity to have this discussion.